Hi everyone. So we've discussed government expenditures and we've discussed government revenue. Expenditures again for defense, domestic programs, and the tax revenue is primarily federal income taxes. So now what we want to do is discuss the government debt and the budget deficit. And we're going to start with the deficit. Now the deficit is measured every year. And what we're looking at is the relationship between tax revenue and government expenditure for that year. And it's been the case that sometimes tax revenue is greater than expenditures. We run a surplus, and then quite more often now our federal government expenditures exceed tax revenue, and that's a deficit, which I think I've actually, yes, I've got it right down here. So if you look at the history of the government, of the budget deficit, from approximately 1955 to 1969, we ran a surplus, meaning that tax revenue is greater than expenditures. So the government was essentially saving money and running this surplus, which then can be used for unexpected expenditure requirements. Okay. Then, in the summer of 1969, we went from a surplus to a deficit where government expenditures was greater than tax revenue. Now, what also is unique in 1969 is, in the 1969-70 period, all these professional sports teams I rooted for actually won the championship. The New York Jets won the Super Bowl. The New York Knicks won the NBA championship. And the New York Mets won the World Series. Now, we'll tell you about the New York Mets for a second. Before the series started, the New York Mets were discussed in the New York Post, a paper in New York City, and the New York Post said the Mets were playing the Baltimore Orioles, and the Orioles were considered the top team, and the New York Post said that the Baltimore Orioles had better pitching, fielding, and hitting, but the Mets in 5, and the Mets did win the World Series in 5 games. Okay, then, so somewhere in 1969, we go to a deficit where total revenue, tax revenue, is less than government expenditures. Now, this occurred from 1970 to present, except for 1998, 1999. We actually ran a surplus those 2 years, but then it was quickly eliminated. This was at the end of the Clinton administration, and then the Bush administration reduced taxes, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and that actually caused the surplus to go to a deficit. We've been to a deficit ever since. Okay. Now, when the government does spend more money than they have, okay, what they do is the federal government borrows money. Now, they borrow from two general groups. One is people in the U.S., so they'll sell bonds to individuals like you and me. And these bonds are guaranteed rates of return. It's a solid, secure investment with the federal government. So the federal government can borrow money by selling bonds to all of us. And that helps raise money to pay for the deficit where expenditures exceed tax revenue. The other source is borrowing money from countries around the world. Okay? Which is quite amusing, is that China lends us has lent us trillions of dollars over the last 15 years or 20 years. So we have a very complicated relationship with China, but they have loaned us. So what the federal government will do is sell bonds to China. China will buy these bonds up, and with that money, the federal government will be able to finance these larger amount of expenditures. So it's a very complicated international scenario where the U.S. federal government borrows an enormous amount of money from countries around the world. Now, we'll be getting to coronavirus actually a little bit later on in the semester, but right now the deficit is huge this year. The deficit for a given year would be, less than $1 trillion. Okay, the deficit for this year could end up being $3 trillion, which is an exorbitant amount of money. So, what I'm going to discuss next is now the government debt, which is the actual accumulation of all the deficits, and then we'll talk about more about the financing. Okay, see you in a little bit.